So if I could have your attention, please. We have a wonderful afternoon lined up. Our next speaker is David Paulides, followed by George Norrie. Then we'll have the dinner break, which will be followed by Scott Walter and Maria Wheatley. So it's a really excellent evening for speakers. You don't want to miss any of these. They're going to be wonderful. So I'd like to introduce David Paulides, who will be talking about the Bigfoot Sasquatch phenomenon. His presentation last night was brilliant. A round of applause, please, for David.
Okay, so North America Bigfoot Search, that's my other website, and it has nothing in it but facts. When I was first starting into this topic, I had no dog in the fight. I didn't really know much about it, didn't really care much about it. And I was working in technology, and I had some employers that I never knew had an encounter when they were kids. And these guys were zillionaires. And when they were small kids, they went up into the mountains with their folks. And individually, they never knew each other, but they saw one. And after I was leaving their company, they said, Dave, ex-policeman, good investigative skills, we want to tell you a story. And I was floored when these guys told me what happened and that they found each other and they were under similar circumstances. It was bizarre. And they said, hey, there's so much disinformation, misinformation out there on this topic. You go out there and tell us if it's true or if it's not. So I said, okay, I'm not really interested in it, but I could give it a shot. And that's kind of how it got started. They said, hey, we'll pay for everything. You just go out there and prove it's true or if it's not. And they wanted science-based answers. So it was kind of a strange way I got started in this. And what I did was I went on the internet and I looked for specific things I wanted in a location that I was going to research. Number one, I wanted a location that had a police department, had internet, had its historical sightings. I wanted a team setting, so I had to go out and find people that could support me, and someplace where I could have access to the internet daily. And I ended up at Hoopa, and Hoopa's in Northern California. It's 30 miles south of the Patterson Gimlin site where Bigfoot was first filmed in '67. And that's how it all got started. And what I did is I went up into Hoopa, not knowing anybody, and I went into the police department and I said, hey, I'm a retired cop, introduced myself, explained what I wanted to do, and immediately doors were broke down for me, and I was very fortunate. Policeman to policeman, these guys trusted me. They knew I wouldn't disrespect the elders, and they introduced me to elders in the community. So what might have taken years to break through with relationships, I broke through in hours. And within 2 days of being on the reservation, they were introducing me to 80 and 90-year-old people who had a history with Bigfoot. It was an amazing transition. So when I was a policeman, we used FBI-trained forensic artists, meaning that when a robbery occurred, let's say at a bank or at a 7-Eleven, they would bring in the artist to draw a sketch of the person who did the robbery based on the witness's identification. And I knew that these artists, some of them, there were a handful in the US, were phenomenal. Meaning that when they got the sketch and the suspect was eventually arrested, they looked identical. It's like a strange thing. And I'm serious, they looked identical. So I said, wow, let's try something different. Let's go out and get an FBI-trained forensic artist to sit down with the witnesses who had a face-to-face with Bigfoot and draw what they saw. That would be a breakthrough. So I did a search, and I found Harvey Pratt. And Harvey, the drawing on the bottom right, is of a suspect that abducted 2 girls. That was a picture of him when they arrested him. Tell me that that's not close. And that's the way all of his drawings were. Now, Harvey just got awarded 6 months ago the Native American ceremonial display at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. They're building it right now. It was based on his drawings and He's just an unbelievable guy. He's a Cheyenne Arapaho Native American chief. He was also the #2 man in the Oklahoma Bureau of Investigation. So he's got this investigative approach, the spiritual side to him, and a Native American side. He was the perfect guy to do the work. The other thing I did is, coming from law enforcement, I said every sighting report I take, I'm going to require an affidavit from the person signing under penalty of perjury that what they're saying is true. It's one more hurdle in every report. So you add the affidavit, you add the drawing, and now you have something really unique that hasn't been done in the Bigfoot arena ever. And that's how I started. So I didn't want to do the conventional approach. I didn't want to do anything that was questionable. I wanted it all right down the line. And I also wanted to have some fundamental background in the topic before I leapt. And there was a man named Ray Crow who ran what was called the Track Record. The Track Record was a 17-year newsletter that he did out of Oregon on the topics of Bigfoot, UFOs, cryptozoology. 17 years, it's like 3,600 pages of documents. Ray was retiring from that world. He was trying to sell his research. I went up there, met with him, and I bought it all. And I took that, and I spent weeks studying everything he wrote because it was so good. And I put that on a USB, and it's called the Track Record of Bigfoot Encyclopedia, because I don't think there's anything like it in the world. And the amount of sighting reports, photos, and things, it was just a wealth of information. And Ray sat me down. I was really new into it. He said, Dave, you're a smart guy. The more you learn, the less you're going to understand. And damn, if that wasn't true. It's really a humbling experience on this topic. And then the other thing is this last thing right here. There's dozens of DNA entries that Ray categorized over the years on Bigfoot. But you don't hear about that. Why not? Because it doesn't fit the paradigm that's perpetuated out there in the Bigfoot world. A couple of things. I'm no Bigfoot expert. And I have never met a Bigfoot expert. And those people you see out there that are running these shows and things, it's amazing because they're not experts either, but some claim they are. There's a couple shows coming out in the next month, and I was asked to be on each one of them, and I've always turned them down. And the reason being is that I know, because I've done these shows for the networks, that many times they try to control what you're saying. They try to control the essential part of the episode and what it's going to portray. And I would never play a part in that because I know what the facts are, and I live in that world of facts, and I don't want to be manipulated, and I don't want to be made to look like a fool. And there's a couple of networks that toe the line and a couple that are just out of this world crooked. And so be careful what you believe when you watch these shows. So after spending 2 years straight in Hoopa, I wrote this book called The Hoopa Project. And it was the Bigfoot Book of the Year when it came out. And it's got extraordinary ratings. I've been very lucky because it's filled with facts. And in the Bigfoot world, there's this ape versus human argument. And you don't hear much about the human side of that equation, but you're going to hear a lot about the ape side because that's the loudest, most vocal group out there. And if somebody new comes along, like me, I was called everything but what I am by some leaders out there. And they said that my book was a fraud, the guy's a crook, all of these things that were so negative. It's because I was pushing against the wave of contrariness on the topic. And again, it's just facts. And like I said, I have great reviews on my books because they're just filled with facts. Second book I came out with about 3 more years later, it's called Tribal Bigfoot. And it was a follow-up because the people out there that attacked me said, Well, that's what those things look like in Hoopa. But across the rest of the U.S., that's not what they look like. Now remember, Harvey's drawing exactly to what the people tell him. It's their drawing, it's not his. So we started to march across the U.S. and we went to a series of other reservations. And he interviewed them under the same conditions, and I had him write the same affidavits, and son of a gun, if they didn't look human. And wow, and what happened was that the screaming and yelling at me just got louder and louder. And the negativity got worse and worse. So one of the things that elders will tell you, if you really get their confidence, is that Bigfoot, their hair color will follow that of a human. And when they're real young, they have a lighter tone. As they get older, they get darker. And as they get real old, they get gray hair. So when you hear these stories about a gray-haired Bigfoot, I believe them, because that's what the elders told us early on. And some of the drawings in the books that we have show this lighter framed, just like an older man. When they're big, they're mature, they're strong and big, and as they get older, they get frail. And it's an amazing transition. So what Harvey did is, this is the Patterson Gimlin face off the film in '67. And what he did was, just like in a bank robbery suspect, how somebody has a beard, well, Harvey can take the beard off so you can kind of see what the person looks like underneath the hair. So he took the hair off of Patty, and guess what it looked like? It looks like a Native American. That's kind of surprising. Anybody know who Doug Hychek is? Nobody? You ever watch a show called Monster Quest? Anybody hear that? Yeah, he was the executive producer for Monster Quest. So Doug sees what we did and he goes, Dave, son of a gun. He goes, we did that for our show, got the same results, and the network wouldn't let us put it on. And I'm not kidding you. Why? Because Monster Quest had a series of people on it that believed it was an ape, and that was contrary. He goes, but you did it. He goes, wow, the results are just almost identical. I go, well, thanks. So it was true. Tribal Bigfoot, another big seller, great ratings. Now, this is an interesting story. As I was doing the research on missing people, and I spent 9 years now doing that, I would go through archives, and I would go through archives from the 1800s, and I would run across these newspaper stories that talked about wild men. And at the beginning, I probably passed 20, 30 articles that said that, and I didn't even pay attention. But then I started to realize that the Bigfoot of today is the wild man of the 16, 17, and 1800s. And it was consistent, whether it was from Spain, Europe, wild men were the Bigfoot of today. Hair colored, filled with hair all over their body, wild, lived in the woods. Very, very similar characteristics in the newspaper articles from long ago until today. And I started cutting out the articles. And I put them in this huge folder. And then about 6 months ago, I said, I got to do something with this. All that book is articles from newspapers around the world that describe a hairy, colored, human-type, bipedal person living in the woods. Almasty from Russia, Yeren from China, whatever it was. It's amazing how close the stories are. And I tell people that if you're the ultimate pessimist on the topic, get that book and give it to them, because it's very hard to overcome those arguments from newspapers long ago. And that's what that was. And an interesting part of the story to me was that wild men, it's not a wild monster, it's not a wild gorilla, ape, orangutan, whatever, but they called them wild men. Think about that. And the behavior that's described in the articles is very human. And then the other part of that was, as I'm going through these articles, I started to get these stories about giants that were discovered by farmers, ranchers, all over North America. It was bizarre. And a lot of these articles talk about, we called the Museum of Natural History in Maryland and they came over and they picked it up. Or they called the Smithsonian and came over and picked them up. It is so exact who got it. And then you go back to those locations. Oh, we don't have it. Where are they? And you got to think about that. Nobody wants to claim to have these remnants anymore. And the articles have some really good drawings in them of what was found and how they were laid out. A lot of them were in a seated position. They weren't laying flat. And they had specific gemstones and tools with them. It's fascinating to read. So I included the giants. And the giants were found in much proximity to where the Bigfoot sightings were at. Now let's think about this. So the giants were anywhere from 7, 8 feet tall, and there's stories of them up to 12 feet tall in North America. Kind of the same size as the Bigfoot, too. It's kind of interesting. In the same locations. So why is all this information suppressed? And I say it's suppressed because no museum wants to admit they have it. Two young Vermont hunters terribly scared. And it says, much excitement prevails among the sportsmen in this vicinity over the story that a wild man was seen Friday last by two young men while hunting in the mountains of Williamstown. The young men described the creature of being only 5 feet tall, resembling a man in form and movement, but covered all over with bright red hair and having a long, scraggly beard and with very wild eyes. When first seen, the creature sprang from behind a rocky cliff and started for the woods nearby. When mistaking it for a bear or other wild animal, one of the other men fired, and it is thought wounded it. For the fierce cries of pain and rage, it turned on its assailants, driving them at high speed. They lost their guns and ammunition in their flight and dared not return for fear of encountering the strange being. So they shoot at it, they hit it, it's 5 foot tall, and it turns on them, and they ran. A couple of brave guys. So, let's go back to the track record for a second. I told you that there were a series of DNA notations. DNA is nothing new to the Bigfoot world. It's been done by a series of people over the decades. What is strange is that you're not hearing anything about it, and it's suppressed. I want you to think about all the academic types that claim to be associated with the Bigfoot world. They could go out and write a grant tomorrow and get a grant from the government to study the topic. None will. The reason being, I've said this at conferences with them sitting in the front row, because they know the results. They'd be replicating the same thing that we did with our study a couple years ago. They know. None of the DNA tests have ever come back ape, gorilla, orangutan, lemur, nothing. It always comes back as a human. And the reason being, it's a strange human DNA context, but the blood and hair samples confirm it's Bigfoot. When you get a Bigfoot hair, I could teach any 12-year-old how to identify a Bigfoot hair in less than 20 minutes, and they'd be an expert. Because it looks different than human hair. It looks different than every other hair in the rainbow. When a hair and fiber expert, and there are those out there that work for state and the FBI, they have a graph of all the mammalian hair in North America. So when they get hair off a carpet of a crime or something, they'll look to see what that hair matches. A Bigfoot hair has this I'll show you some pictures, has some very strange characteristics to it. It's like nothing else in North America. And so one of the hurdles in doing DNA tests on Bigfoot hair, or any hair, is you have to first identify the hair. If you look at it under a microscope and you say, oh, that's a bear hair, well, you're not going to do DNA testing if you're trying to find out it's Bigfoot. But some of these quote-unquote geneticists that have done the DNA testing say, oh, yeah, that was submitted as Bigfoot hair. We took it straight to DNA, and it's not Bigfoot hair, it's bear hair. That's pure stupidity, folks. To do DNA testing on a hair, on a follicle, costs right now between $7,500 and $15,000. Why would you do that when you could exclude it if you vetted it at the beginning and you put it through a hair and fiber expert? Doesn't make any sense. When we did our DNA testing, we had 2 hair and fiber experts that vetted every hair that came through. If it was identified as another kind of mammal, obviously we're not going to test it. But these guys out there that are on these Bigfoot shows, oh, no, we took it straight to DNA testing and we found out it was a bear. That's stupidity. And you know it's manipulated because of that. So, all of the returns on Bigfoot hair since 1970 came back as human. This is an article, you will never see it discussed anywhere. It's in one of my first, it was in the Hoopa Project, I think. This is a great story. 1924. When I found this, I could not believe I was the idiot that found it. Because there were so many smart researchers in this world, in the Bigfoot world, that claimed that they had all the information on it. And then I started thinking about it, and some friends said, Dave, the reason they don't want to talk about it is it's contrary to what they're pushing. So what it is, 1924, a group of people are hiking in the Pacific Northwest, and they get a series of rocks thrown at them on a trail. And they came back and they told the sheriff what happened, and the sheriff says, okay, makes a public announcement, we're going to get a posse together, and we're going to go out and hunt this big hairy thing and kill it, because it's obviously a threat. 3 Native American groups, the Klalem, the Lumi, and the Quinault, get together and they have a press conference. Do you know how unusual that is that 3 Native American tribes get together on anything? Well, they do. And they have a press conference and they say, don't go out and hunt these things. They're not like you and me. They're different, but they're another tribe of people. He said this. And they called it the Silatex. And they said that they can mimic any sound in the forest. And they have special abilities that we don't have. And they have supernatural powers. And we trade with them, and they have their own language. Contrary to everything that you're told. And this was way back then. And this isn't the only article that talks about this. There's many articles, but you're not going to see them because people don't want to talk about it. And, again, if I'm the person who comes out with this, and you're in the audience and you're seeing me viciously attacked, gee, do you want to step into my arena? If you have some valuable information, do you want to step up and get attacked like that? And this is why academic types don't want to come into that Bigfoot world. Because they're going to get attacked, and they're going to get demeaned, and they don't want anything to do with it. If you think that's not true, I know a few, and there's no way that they're stepping into that. Another article. They talked about a lost race of giants. The ape researchers ignored the Native American claims that these are people. They don't want to talk about it. They won't acknowledge it. If you ask one of those people on stage about this, you go, oh, they'll say, oh, this is just a fallacy. You can't believe it. But it's also those same people that won't step into that world to talk to those tribes, to understand, hey, they were the people that were out there in the woods that were taking care of our territory before we ever got here. I'm big into history. And I have friends that are experts with the Bhagavad-Gita. Anybody know what this is? This is the oldest religious document. It's 5,000 years old, and it's a volume of books. And in it, they talk about something almost identical to a Bigfoot creature. And they say it's part of the Hindu-Krishna text. They talk about it as a living spiritual life form. And Mahatma Gandhi has talked about it. Robert Oppenheimer called the verses in the document at the first detonation of the nuclear bomb. He said, I am becoming death and the destroyer of the worlds. My son has become an expert at this, and he was one of the people that did our first movie. He was the director on my first movie. And he said, Dad, you got to look at this. You won't believe what's in this text. And he goes, what you're saying has been true. And they talked about demons shifting in weather. What's unusual about that is that I talk about the weather being an issue on the people who disappear. And in the Bhagavad-Gita, they talked about the forest demons, how they come down into the villages and they steal women. They're hairy looking like humans. They walk like a man. And they stated that they lived under the mountains. My God. This is a 5,000-year-old document, and it just drilled it. Again, something you're not going to hear about, but I think it's something that's really important. Let's talk about the DNA study. It started with hair samples I received from near Bluff Creek. And there was a researcher up there, an 80-year-old man, who had some friends on the Hooper Reservation. They saw a biped come onto the property and reach over a metal like garbage tin and grab 2 bags of garbage and walk away with them. He went there, and right where you reach over the garbage bin, there was a bundle of hair where it like pulled back. And he gave it to me, and there were follicles in the hair. And I looked under a microscope right away. It's Bigfoot hair. Sent him to Dr. Ketchum. And there wasn't one lab that would touch him and do it. Not one that I could find, and I called 12. So, call Dr. Ketchum, she does it. She goes, Dave, I have never seen results like this. You have something highly unique. It appears to be human. I'm not 100%, but let's keep going with it. And 2 weeks before, I'll bring this name up because it's funny, Josh Gates submitted some hair samples from Nepal that had the same sort of results as ours. So what I did was, 2 weeks later, I was on George Knapp's show on Coast to Coast. And Melba and I had talked, and I said, hey, let's get together and ask for hair samples, blood, saliva samples on Bigfoot from across the US. Let's see what it brings in. We did that, and we got 115 different samples from Canada and the US. And we got some of the most unique samples you can imagine. And that's what started the Ketchum DNA study. You're going to hear a lot of things because this study just destroyed the ape-gorilla theory. And they did everything they could to destroy this study. Lied, cheated, demeaned, libeled. So, how did we do this? Simple. The more simple the theory and the execution, the more likely you're going to succeed. And you guys will laugh. Take packing tape, turn it inside out on a tree, put bacon grease at the top, and as it comes over and leans, it'll pull the hair out, pulling the follicle with it. We get the hair sample. Don't ever put a camera trap or game cameras, anything near it, because that will just force them away. But we got hair sample after hair sample after hair sample this way. And I tell people this, don't go out and do it because there's no need anymore. And you're just going to get the same results, but it worked. Easily identifiable. Almost immediately when you look at Bigfoot hair, it'll remind you of almost like pubic hair. Very similar. Longer, different colors, but it's thick like that. It's coarse. And there's the difference. It's unique. It has what people call guards. It's almost like a scaling effect, one over the other over the hair that protects it. It's like nothing else. And immediately when you look under a microscope, it looks like no other mammal hair anywhere in the world. So, human hair, top left, and the fragmentation inside the hair at the top right, it's fragmented. There isn't a straight line of DNA through the middle of the hair like there is on human hair. I just have these reversed. So the only way you can get mitochondrial DNA out of a Bigfoot hair is out of the follicle. And that is key. If you don't have the follicle, you really don't have anything. Again, reviewed by hair and fiber experts. When you get any sort of DNA sample, you got to clean it. And you clean it incessantly to make sure that it's not contaminated. There's something called a Q30 score. And this is why I'll go toe-to-toe with anybody, because they don't understand the system like we do. But 80% of all the DNA samples we collected went to the Louisiana State Crime Lab for the extraction and for the testing. Why is that important? Because it's completely automated. They cleanse the sample, they extract the DNA, and they test it. And it's put people on death row. And it gives the sample what's called a Q30 score. A Q30 score is the relative accuracy of the DNA that's extracted. So the scores on every one of our samples are so far in the top percentage for accuracy, they couldn't be wrong. So on our website is our study, and it's a white paper that was written by 4 PhDs. I'm sure you guys probably have never even heard of this. But the 4 PhDs who wrote the paper, all the testing was done by either Louisiana or 4 certified labs. One was the University of Texas. And when we submitted it, we didn't tell them what we had. And they came back and they said, what is this, some kind of Amazon tribe that's never been found? It's bizarre. We didn't say anything because we knew that if we told them, yeah, it's Bigfoot, they'd shut it down. They wouldn't want to talk about it. Just kept it generic. Now, before I go on here, DNA, we don't have the ability to manipulate it now. Because some people say, oh, it's just manipulated. Well, show us the scientists that can do that. Contamination claim, baseless. Now, here's a piece of tissue that came out of Northern California. That is a piece of Bigfoot. And it came from a guy who was hunting up in Northern California, who's a very strange person. And he shot a Bigfoot. He really did. Because that's really Bigfoot hair. And it's from one of those tissue samples that we found out there that came from the nuclear DNA that we found. So mitochondrial DNA is like step 2 of 3. Nuclear DNA will tell you the entire heritage, male and female, of something. Mitochondrial only tells you the female. And this is the hair sample, or the flesh sample. It says a small sample of flesh with hair was analyzed by Douglas Toller, MD, FCAP, of the Anatomic and Clinical Pathology Unit at Hughley Pathology Consultants in Fort Worth. Dr. Toller determined that the skin was not human and that the tissue was not contaminated with bacteria or fungus. Several hairs with follicles on sample 26 and sent to the Southwestern Institute of Forensic Sciences in Dallas for analysis. The hairs were processed robotically. Key point. The core sample of the flesh was taken to ensure no contamination. This sample contained a high quality of DNA that yielded both mitochondrial and nuclear. The nuclear was of high enough quantity and quality that core samples underwent a structural analysis using electron microscopy. Folks, there were no mistakes about any of this. The whole study took about $370,000. It's very well done. Testing results, I won't go through all of it, but essentially you know what I know and I've explained it to you. When the study analyzed the mitochondrial DNA contained in the skin tags of the Bigfoot hair, every sample tested human. The point can't be stressed. Non-human hair yielded human mitochondrial DNA. When you link the eyewitness testimony with what was witnessed, a large hairy biped hominid leaving the hair, you now have empirical evidence that Bigfoot is a human hybrid. Now, what was the result of that? The nuclear testing showed, nuclear shows male and female. The nuclear showed that the female side of the equation could be tracked back 12 to 15,000 years to the Middle East. That was through an organization called GenBank, which is the world repository for DNA. GenBank has 352 billion base pairs of DNA. Everybody who goes through DNA testing eventually goes through GenBank one way or another. The male side of the equation, first time in the history of GenBank, there were no results. Think about what that means. That male human side of the equation never has been categorized. It was a first. There's a lot of biblical meaning behind that if you understand the Bible. And there's a person out there who wrote a book, Scott Carpenter, who talked about Enoch and the Nephilim. And if you look at his argument and behind the biblical side, it's very interesting. But how can you do nuclear DNA testing and not get a male equation? It doesn't make any sense, but it's true. And we got we had 12 nuclear samples. They all came back that way. Same thing. I'm going to explain the contamination a little bit that the people argue incessantly about. So the Q30 scores of 88.6, 88.4, 88.7 in the red conclusively prove that the sequences were from a single source, non-contaminated, and that the qualities of the sequences were far above the average genome of 80 sequenced using Illumina next generation sequencing platform. Anybody who knows anything about genetic testing knows that those are so far above contaminated levels, it's ridiculous. Now think about this. And I tell this to people that just have no ability to comprehend. Even if it was contaminated, we would find a male side of that equation in GenBank, right? But they didn't. Conclusion. Samples submitted from 14 states, 2 Canadian provinces, a total of 110, that were eventually screened. 100 plus samples passed screening and eliminated wildlife and humans. Saliva, blood, tooth, fingernail, and hairs were submitted. Samples sent to 4 different labs under a blind testing agreement, and all came back the same. 2 decades of DNA testing on purported Bigfoot samples yielded all human results. Every time DNA is done on Bigfoot, it comes back as human. And what do they say? Oh, it's contaminated. No samples returned apes, Denisovans, or Neanderthals. Female tracked 15,000 years, no male match. Summary. Sasquatch walks upright. It swims. Rob Alley wrote a book about Alaska Bigfoot, and he wrote 10 stories about how fishermen and things have seen the Bigfoot swimming across in between the islands in southern Alaska. DNA equals a hybrid human. Every Native American tribe calls them another tribe. They never call them an animal, ever. Historical name, wild man. This is an argument that you see all the time. It's a Gigantopithecus. So, Gigantopithecus home is Vietnam, China, Indonesia, India. No evidence of high intellect. The evidence of its existence is a tooth and partial jaw, not even a full jaw and nothing more. No evidence it's ever been in North America. No evidence it could walk upright. No ape, gorilla bones, or fossils have ever been found in North America. Think about that. This is Rob's book called The Raincoast Sasquatch. No ape bones, no ape hair. Apes don't like to swim. Apes don't use language. And I refer to the Sierra Sounds. In our second movie that came out in June, I put in there a segment that Ron Moorhead has about a series of sounds that were heard by hunters in the Sierra Nevada mountains in the 1970s. Why this is important is that they thought, wow, this is strange. We're going to bring some, just a recorder in here on horseback, and we're going to record this. If it was recorded today, it'd be irrelevant because it would probably be manipulated. But in the 1970s, they took the sound recordings they took from this camp, and they gave it to some experts at the University of Wyoming and the University of Colorado. And they tested the sounds, and they were outside the range of human, and there were multiple sounds on top of each other that were above and below that of a human could make. And then Scott Nelson, who's a cryptolinguist specialist, said there was verbs used in that language segment that was recorded. And he said it was language. Apes have definitive DNA. No ape DNA has ever been recovered in the North American wild. Facts. This is what's important. No other Bigfoot group has ever utilized an affidavit. And when I started with the affidavit, I copied what John Green did with it about 50 years ago in Canada. So why would no other group do this? And I'll tell you why. There's a couple of groups out there, some of them are pretty big, that take the reports that their investigators bring in and they change them. How do I know this? Because 3 people that came to work for me 8 years ago all left other groups because their reports were changed. Because people said it looked like a human, it had little or no hair on its face, and it acted like a human. That was all changed by these groups and put on their website. It looked like an ape, it acted like an ape. I'm telling you the truth. So we have 3 investigators right now still working for us that used to work for other groups. So what we said was, we'll alleviate that. We'll take an affidavit. It can't be changed. No Bigfoot group utilizes an FBI-trained forensic artist. Why not? You know what they use? They use their own artist to draw what they want to see. So why not use a trained person who understands the forensics? Wally Hersham, that's Wally, backed another Bigfoot group to find DNA. He backed them for 9 years. He backed them for 9 years what our group did in 9 months. And he left, and I think he poured like $400,000 or $500,000 in 9 years. And he came over and he goes, "How did you guys do this? It was so easy." The other group, I believe, knew exactly what the DNA stated, and it didn't fit with their paradigm. So they never pushed it. The Patterson Gimlin film. How many people in here have seen that film? All right. I want you to think about this real carefully. First of all, I 100% believe that film is real, and that is a real Bigfoot biped. So think critically. That's a female. How many times, in a percentage-wise, is a female seen versus a male in the wild? It's about 99.5 to 0.5 male to female that are witnessed. In 1967, how many people had the ability to video or take 16mm film of anything in the wild while they were walking through the woods? What percentage do you think had that? 1/10 of 1% maybe? Okay, so what percentage of people today have that ability? Everyone. Exactly. Everybody has that. So the first question I ask you, why haven't we had footage equal to or better than that? That's a hard one to answer. Second question, every time somebody sees a Bigfoot like this, what does it do? It turns and runs for the closest woods. But that one didn't do that. It stayed out in the open. In fact, it stayed out in the open for hundreds of yards down the river in full view. Why is that behavior so different than everyone else? It's in sight for over a minute. And the footage has been stabilized. Right here, I don't care what anybody says, but right there on the right thigh of that biped, when you look at it carefully, it's got a big wound right here. And as it steps, it flexes that wound. I mean, it's open. You could see it. It's sizable. And that's unusual. When it was first seen by Patterson and Gimlin, it was kneeling next to the bank of the gravel. And it had a stick in its hand, and it was going through the gravel. What would cause that thing to walk, not run? It didn't limp. It stayed in view. What would cause that to stay out there? So think about it, though. I mean, that's not 1 in a million. That's 1 in a billion. So there's so many things about that are just perplexing. Now, in a stabilized view, to me, it's remarkable because there's so much about that isn't human. The way it walks, its stride, its size, you just know it's a Bigfoot. So that is what Harvey Pratt did, and that's the Patterson Gimlin creature on the left, and that's Harvey's face with the hair taken off. And again, like I said, Doug Hychek said it's a dead on for what they did. Sample 140, this thing came off of a gutter. And the biped bit right through the gutter. And that's how we got plaque and some other really, really good DNA. Nuclear, we kind of talked about, gen bank, the blast. I'm not going to go through that again. Mitochondrial is the mother. Nuclear is both. The track record I talked about. There's 12 Bigfoot DNA samples that have been tested that are talked about in there. Again, something nobody wants to talk about. And it just validates everything we did. What happened when our study came out? This is funny. I took Melba to coast. We got all the samples, then we started working through them for 9 months. And then Dr. Ketchum says, well, let's have a press conference and release this. And I said, there's no way I'm going there. It's going to be a disaster. Because the news people wanted to make a joke of the whole thing. They didn't want to take it seriously. We wanted to talk about, or the people that appeared there wanted to talk about the science. And I said, don't have a press conference, just release it, a press release with the facts. But don't sit there and talk about it. They're going to make a fool out of you. And that's what they did. And the reality of that is that from that point forward, nobody took it serious. And it's unfortunate because the white paper that was written about it was first looked at by the journal in Nature. And the journal said, hey, if you come back with those results from 4 labs, we're going to put it in our journal. And they came back after the results were done, and they completely, Scott Carpenter has all the emails, they completely lied and manipulated, and it was horrible. When you sign up with a journal, they immediately copyright all of your emails going back and forth, so you can't ever publicize them. Dr. Ketchum got so mad because they had lied so incessantly, she released them and said, sue me. And we've got the emails posted about how they lied. So there's something behind the scenes that's very strange. So since 1970, we talked about the DNA samples, talked about that. Talk about academia. Why hasn't a Bigfoot researcher in academia obtained a DNA sample? They have. They know. They're smart. They understand that every result returns as a hybrid human. Why replicate the sample? They have a sample they did recently that returned as the exact same thing. And how do I know this? They found a Bigfoot bed up in the state of Washington. And they took samples of DNA out of that bed. And they paid to have it done. And it came back as human, and they'll never talk about it. It doesn't fit the paradigm of the academic types that have been purporting and reporting on the topic for decades. No. No. Yeah. Haplotypes? Yes. How much in this world we do not understand or know? And this goes back to, I have a friend named Bruce Maccabee who's a physicist in Ohio. He worked for the Navy for 20 years, and he's one of the smartest people I've ever met. He's getting in later on in his years. And he's given me some photos that are just beyond this world. So it's hard to see this here, but this is a photo of a steer. This is one eye right here. And the camera flashed over the top of it, and it's very hard to see, but there's an orange crest way up at the top. And between the steer and the crest, there's a form in there, and it looks like a Bigfoot. And somebody who sent in the photo, who Bruce knew, said it was the portal opening and the Bigfoot coming through. Now, why is that believable? Because Skinwalker Ranch in Utah was a site that was manned for 3 years by a series of retired FBI agents under Bigelow Aerospace and the National Institute of Discovery of Science. Those guys were impeccably good at documenting everything that happened on that ranch. And one night, a window frame opens up above the meadow, and they see a Bigfoot crawl through the window frame and down on the pasture and run away. It was viewed by the chief scientist and 2 other agents. And what are you going to say about it? So, does it happen? I think it does. There's a better picture up close of that figure coming through the orange background. And when the agents and the chief scientists saw the window frame open, guess what color the backdrop was? Orange. This is bizarre. This came from a police officer in Wyoming who I know. He had a game camera up in northwest Wyoming. And this is a picture the game camera took. About where that arrow is, in another photo, when it's real dark, you can see this strange light. I don't know what it is. But if you look at the right antler on this, there's something there. This is bizarro world. That's what it is. And what it looks like is a miniature Bigfoot in the antler. And I kid you not. I sent this photo to Maccabee, who's an optical physicist, and I said, Bruce, tell me about this. He goes, Dave, this is no shit. That thing was in that antler. That is not a manipulated photo. That's the real deal. And I kind of knew it because I knew the cop who gave it to me. And I said, hey, in this area of Wyoming, how long have you hunted? And he goes, for 30 years. I've never seen anything like this. And when I got this photo, I couldn't believe it. So it kind of looks like the biped's kneeling on the antler looking out. It's bizarro. So that's the name of my organization for the Bigfoot studies. I don't give these talks hardly ever. I think the last one I did was maybe 18 months ago. And the reason I don't is because I don't want to get attacked anymore. I'm comfort in my own skin knowing what I know about the DNA. And people ask me to be on their show. I won't be on their show to talk about Bigfoot. I don't care anymore. And there's a couple other people I know that are coming out with kind of the same feelings I am. It's because you know what you know. You don't want to get attacked anymore. And the truth is the truth. And I tell you guys the truth because you can go on and read the white paper on my website. It's a scientific paper. It's a little sciencey, but it's all science. And it's really hard to overcome those things. Now, I do think that there are some things about the Bigfoot topic that make people uncomfortable. When the Native Americans talk about them having special abilities, I think it's true. I think they can mimic anything in the woods. And there's 3 people I've interviewed in my career who said, this. I'll tell you this story real quick. There was a rancher in Montana that was having his chicken coop broken into every night, and he saw these giant tracks going in and out. And he says, I'm just going to stay in there one night, back myself in with a 12-gauge shotgun with slugs, and I'm going to kill this thing that's taking my chickens because I'm upset. And he was in the coop, and he said the thing walked in, and he goes, Dave, at 4 feet, I drilled it right in the middle of the chest 2 times with slugs. It didn't even flinch. After I shot it, it reached down, grabbed 4 more of my chickens, and walked away. And he goes, that solved my problem. I'm never going in that chicken coop again. He can have all the chickens, and I've heard that same sort of thing. I really don't care how big something is because I know you could down a 1,400-pound grizzly bear with a 20 or a 12-gauge slug. So that Bigfoot is something beyond this world if it could survive that, in my humble opinion. So we have some time. I'll open this up for some questions. Scott.
Dave, I just have something to say about this whole being intact, and I've experienced the same thing for many years. Okay. Scott Walter. Yeah. I just wanted to say that I've experienced the same thing with the research that I've done, being attacked for years. And what I can tell you is this: if they're attacking you, you're doing something right.
Check, check, check.
Thanks, Scott. Yeah, you may be doing something right, but at the time, I had some kids that were in high school, and it was just killing my kids. I mean, they were taking a lot of ridicule. You know, your dad's an idiot, you know. All these people on TV, they've got to be right. Your dad's not on TV. And it was hard at the time. Now they're grown up, graduated from college, and go, Dad, you're onto something. Yeah.
My question is the fact that you didn't find the males. Do you think these females produce offspring without a male?
That's a great question.
It seems if that goes back 12,000 years and you're only getting female, it almost sounds like they don't need a male to reproduce.
Yeah, good question.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anybody else?
I know a lot of people in Arkansas are like that.
My question is, when you put the bacon in the tree and the tape around there, how long did it take, how many days did it take before you to collect the sample?
It depended on the weather and things, but usually we left it about 3 days, no more.
So did you think about, installing a camera out there that would set off when something grabbed the bait?
So people that, specifically single females that live in the middle of the woods, have called us and said, hey, I have a problem. Somebody comes by my window in the middle of the night. This is in the middle of nowhere, and bangs on the side of my house, and I have these big tracks outside. You want to know how to shut that down immediately? Put game cameras up around the house. Won't have the problem anymore. Never use game cameras in association with this research. It'll just shut it down.
What do you mean shut it down? They'll shut the...
They won't come around.
Oh, they won't? They're that smart?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I have a question and comment, David. First of all, thank you for this. And secondly, bloodhounds have a tremendous sense of smell. But bloodhounds are not the animal with the greatest sense of smell. I understand it's bear. And if a Bigfoot has a sense of smell anywhere near that of the bear, perhaps they can smell batteries and electrical things and avoid them for that reason, just as an idea.
So what happened is that the Native Americans would, because when I was in Hoopa, I'm initially going to the first place you guys are going to. Let's put up some game cameras. Let's get some pictures. Elders would say right away, hey, when you walk into those woods, they know you're there. And some of the biggest trailheads in existence, we're starting to think that they have something called maybe scouts that are watching these trailheads. And they know immediately when you're walking into that area. So if you're setting up cameras, they probably know they're there when you're putting them up. It's their area. They're going to know. Yeah.
So I've actually read the white paper, and one of the things that you didn't mention but I found very curious was the sex chromosomes, the appearance of things like YY, which is not existent in humans. XXY being functional, XYY, and that's ridiculous to even try to imply that that's anything human or not a completely different species.
So on the female side, it's human. On the other side, we don't know. But everything matches with a hybrid human. That's why I'm not saying it's a human, but it's a hybrid human.
No, I mean the people who criticize it saying that, it's one, if we were to adulter DNA, if we could, would we create something that's completely foreign to the human genome? It's ridiculous. That would take a ton of work.
If we could do it. Yeah.
I was active with the RAW group for many years, and RAW took us to Bigfoot Park in British Columbia, and I actually had two encounters. One was meditative, where I saw a camp of Bigfoot. Some had gray hair, most had the brown hair. And then later on, some years later, I saw a Bigfoot, what you would call shadow-like, about 12 feet high, that you could have walked through. And Ross said that they are a very ancient, old energy, and that extraterrestrials put them on the planet in various places in case we humans blew ourselves up in nuclear war as a reserve gene pool. And they were put in interdimensional reality so we humans wouldn't be able to get to them. Occasionally they get trapped in our reality, and then people can do what they want. Thank you.
So, little side note. Everyone's watched Star Wars, and you know the Wookiee in Star Wars? So, John Mack was a real famous researcher that was employed at Harvard. He was a psychiatrist. And he started to get into the abduction world, and he started to write some books about people who had been abducted. And he said, you know, there's really something to this. And some of those people who had been abducted reported seeing Bigfoot-type creatures on their craft when they were abducted. And it was said that they were subservient to the whatever aliens that were dealing with the people, but they were there. And other people have said that Spielberg had some insight, and that's why he put the Wookiees on Star Wars that were kind of subservient to us. And it's an interesting side note, and other people have tried to interview Spielberg about it, and he won't talk about it. Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned that they had supernatural abilities, so I was wondering if one of those was telepathy?
That's what some people say.
While our next questionnaire is coming up, I'll just mention briefly, and I think I may have mentioned this to David last night, but Edgar Casey's son, Julian Casey, wrote a book where he spoke about temples of purification that occurred in Atlantis and Egypt, in which he said humans had pushed their consciousness into all sorts of animals, and they were creating a temple to remove tails, feathers, and fur from humans. And Casey also talks about the level of technology getting quite high, and that on the island of Arion, they developed a refined human body, and it became really highly advanced, and that part of it was benevolent. Then it became quite highly advanced and began creating a race of slave beings that Casey called abominations. And so I have wondered sometimes if perhaps the Atlanteans from Arion got so far into it that they created a half race of animals and humans, because Casey said that the minotaurs, the half horse, the half bull humans actually existed in human experimentation. Is it possible, and this is just an idea, that the Atlanteans were successful in developing a human ape hybrid for heavy labor in forestry and in caves, and that if so, were they programmed in such a way to fear humans, but to also have a human level of thought? Just as an idea. So,
I had a chance to talk to a Navajo woman elder who was in negotiations with Sasquatch to have them play with the native children again, like they used to play with the native children. And she said that they were beginning to show themselves a little bit more. that they disappeared quite a while ago because humanity was going in a different direction. And since they could be in another dimension, they chose to disappear from sight during the time where humanity is struggling with, our survival or our basic humanity, all of those big issues that are up right now. And so I'm having even a hard time explaining some of this because there's that extra kind of veiling that goes on. But I called her because I had a experience of sleeping next to a very hairy being. And I phoned her up and I said, oh my gosh, I can't believe, because you just were telling me these things that were happening in your tribe. And here I am sitting in Des Moines, Iowa with a dream of being with this hairy being. She had me do some things, and it was basically around what did this being smell like. And what she told me is that Bigfoot actually smells very good, and that when humans sight a Sasquatch being, that it's actually their own lousy scent that they're smelling, because they're in the presence of a higher being that is naturally cleansing their field. So I wondered, in nothing that you talked about did you talk about Bigfoot smell, and also I'm wondering if you have heard from the native peoples any sort of diplomatic work that's going on to reclaim their, relationship with these beings.
Smell. I've heard reports all over the galaxy on smell, from horrible to rose to, it's all over the map. I don't think you can really decide anything from those reports. As far as Native Americans coming to some sort of agreement, they uniformly believe that you shouldn't try to exploit it. And in Hoopa, there's a portion of the reservation that is theirs, and you don't go there. And at the end of my 2 years, the head of the tribe calls me in, and he had a couple of his guys there that were just like the lumbermen for the tribe. That's how they make their money. They sell lumber. And he said, Dave, this is the first time in 10 years anyone's gone in there, but they're going to take you in that area, and you're going to spend the day in there just so you can see it. So I went in there. It was about a 6-mile hike in through some really rough area, and we got in there. And the one thing that was unreal is that there were some areas near the backside of the Klamath River where one area in particular, I've never seen this, there had to have been 100 or more piles of bear scat within a 100-foot radius of each other. I've never seen that. There was so much, it was ridiculous. And bears are really, really common in that area and around the tribe, but that was the only thing really about being in there that was super unusual. And I know it didn't look anything like the quote-unquote Bigfoot's defecation, but it was just strange. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Round of applause, please, for David. I think this work that he's doing is absolutely amazing, and it is wonderful to have a man of integrity involved in that. So please, standing ovation, please. And so next up,
yeah. Tip, what would you do if your woman left you?
Oh, I don't know about that, Marvin. I just have to let my harmonica talk for me.
Oh, that's what I'm talking about.
Just like this.
say about that now? What you got to say about that now? Eh? Oh, yeah. Oh, I know you can feel it. Too, but that's not all. No, I'm gonna do for you. I said, bring it to me. Bring your sweet loving. Bring it on home to me. Yeah. Oh, Chip, I don't have it either one or twice.